Exposing parameters in a finished material is probably one of the most powerful parts of the Substance Designer workflow, simply because it gives the final texture artist the ability to completely change how the final material looks according to the needs of the project. This also means that people who may not actually be texture artists, such as level designers, etc., can also change how the texture looks inside the game level or final rendered scene without ever having to get the original texture artist involved. Now, obviously each studio has its own workflow and changes may need to be pre-approved, but even if the original texture artist is asked to make the changes, having exposed parameters means that he or she can make them right away, there and then, without ever having to come back into Substance Designer at all. Now, we only have time to expose a couple of parameters in this particular video, but one thing that I will also show is how to link multiple parameters together so that they can then all be driven by just a single control. Do also keep in mind that although nearly every parameter found in Substance Designer can be exposed, we will most likely want to keep things as simple as possible, and only expose parameters that can make a significant difference to the texture. Inside our relief graph then, let's locate and frame up on the splatter circular node that controls the petal-like stones inside the star inset frame. And then click so that we have access to its parameters. In the instance parameters rollout, let's click the function icon on the pattern amount parameter, and then choose the expose parameter option. Once done, a dialog will appear that lets us either select an existing parameter or create a new one. And so, let's click to access the drop-down and choose the new option. This will let us add a name, and so let's call this radial stone amount. After clicking OK, and with the new name selected in the drop-down box, we can click OK again. The controls for the pattern amount slider should now disappear, which is fine, as they've been moved to the graph controls. We can come to the Explorer window and click on the main graph, named Floor, in order to load up the parameters for the graph. And if we scroll down, we should see our exposed parameter, listed inside the Input Parameters rollout. Let's open up the rollout and organize things a little better, something that will become all the more important to do as we start to work with multiple exposed parameters. The identifier and label parameters I tend to keep the same, so there is less to keep track of, and so that the name that appears in the UI of the host application is clearly the parameter that I want. I will call both of these radial stone amount. But do feel free to give it a name that makes sense to you and your workflow. Now the group section lets us split exposed parameters into collapsible headers. All parameters that share the same group name will be placed inside this kind of UI element. Let's place this one inside a group called stone amount for demonstration purposes. Of course, these groups could be called diffuse, normal, and roughness if we had exposed parameters controlling those parts of the material. Again, the naming will most likely depend on your workflow. As we are looking to control the radial pattern of our stones, there are a few things that we need to consider here. For example, we can see that the default value is set at the number the node had when we exposed this parameter, which we can leave as is. However, by default, the slider for the minimum amount is set at 1, which is not the look I had in mind when creating the material. So, we need to make sure that there are at least some stones in the pattern, with anything less than 4 looking a little strange to me. And so, let's set the minimum amount for the slider at 4. For the maximum value slider, we of course have the reverse problem, as this by default is set to 64. Looking at the material, it's clear that 64 repeats simply couldn't fit. But just in case a texture artist can create a pattern that we have not thought of, let's give that artist more control then by setting this to around about 20 repeats. Because we have an even number of points in our background, we can set the step value to 2. Now this will mean the user cannot introduce an odd number of stone petals into the design. From the input parameters rollout, we can test how this works by clicking the preview button and then changing our slider value. Bear in mind as you do though that this is a material change that may take some time to update in the graph, and so you may want to set a smaller preview size before doing this. Let's set this to a value of 8 then and see what happens. Which, whilst the number of petals changes, it doesn't look right as there are other parameters that need to change at the same time as well. For example, we have ruined the teardrop shape reliefs that are supposed to sit on top of the petals. Let's fix that by controlling all these aspects of our material via one expose parameter. Coming out of preview mode, we can select the splatter circular node inside the triangle relief frame and expose the number parameter just as we did before. Only this time, from the drop-down list, we will choose the radial stone amount parameter name, and then click OK. We will need to do this for the second splatter circular node in that same frame, like so. And then let's do the same for the starburst node in the circle relief frame, exposing its branches parameter. And then choosing our same radial stone amount parameter from the list. Now this will remove a few of the branches, so if we wish to keep them, feel free to try and expose it as its own parameter. Now because we have exposed more options to the same parameter though, we have now messed up the housekeeping work that we did, and so we may want to save setting up identifiers and labels until the end. Let's set the identifier and label to be the same radial stone amount as before though. We can add the group name of stone amount, and then preview the parameter. When we set the value to 8 now, we see all 3 nodes update and produce a much better result. When we export this substance now, this parameter will be open for the artist to change. If you want to see more, check out the rows graph and take a look at the parameters exposed there in order to get an even better feel for how this all works.